I'm Adele Hite. I am a PhD student in communication, rhetoric, and digital media at NC State. But my background is in nutrition, and I guess I'll let you know how it is that I feel like I have the authority to talk about meat and the politics of nutrition. To start with, I experienced some of the politics myself. So I was in a PhD program in nutrition epidemiology at UNC Chapel Hill, that other school down the road from us at NC State. And as an epidemiologist, what we're interested in, we're interested in these differences between sort of before things happen and then after things happen. For instance, if you saw a curve like this as an epidemiologist, and you saw that at the point of the inflection in the curve, there was the installation of a water treatment plant, you might be really curious about how that water treatment plant is affecting the water supply if the cases of gastroenteritis, so stomach upsets, in the population are going up. So maybe it's not cleaning the water as well as we think it is, maybe it's leaching out into the water supply, maybe the consumers are treating this water differently. We don't really know why, but we would want to investigate that. Well, so there I am at UNC, interested in this curve, where we see the rise in overweight and obesity occurs after we create a national policy that's supposed to prevent rises in overweight and obesity. So I was just really interested in why this might be and how it is that this policy might have changed behavior, changed the food environment, changed the way we think about food, changed the way that we behave towards food. And then I was asked to not talk about it. So I found my way over to NC State and got started on sort of a different track with some different theoretical frameworks that let me ask the questions, one of which is, why are we always beating up on meat? From the beginning, when we created our dietary guidelines, meat was always sort of the bad guy. And at the beginning, it was cholesterol, total fat in meat, then saturated fat in meat is really the problem, then TMAO in meat, and excess iron in meat, and now with the 2015 dietary guidelines, the sustainability of meat. Basically, whatever it is about meat, it doesn't matter how you fix it, we don't like it. So that's been part of our attitude towards meat in terms of national nutrition policy from the beginning. So I'm going to dig into that a little deeper and see if we can figure out what's going on. This was Secretary Tom Vilsack, after the 2010 dietary guidelines came out. He says, with extreme confidence, having read them at least once, that the science behind these guidelines is unquestioned. Well, as the Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee was putting together a 2015 Dietary Guidelines Advisory Report, and they reached the conclusion that it's pretty typical of what we've been saying for 35 years, that a healthy diet has vegetables, fruits, whole grains, low-fat dairy, fish, seafood, lean meat. We should lower our consumption of red meat and processed meat due to all the fat, saturated fat, and cholesterol that we're also not concerned about anymore. But their recommendations removed lean meat from the list of recommended foods and kept in the idea that red and processed meat should be lowered as well. So this did raise some issues. There's been lots of pushback on Capitol Hill about this. And Vilsack was sort of in the hot seat just earlier last week. And he had sort of a different attitude towards the science behind the guidelines at that point. You're not ever going to have something that is just basically going to be a fact about this. Basically saying, you have science on one side of the issue, you have science on the other side of the issue. The science is uncertain. He sounded a lot less sure about the science behind the guidelines, and as far as I'm concerned, quite a bit more accurate, because policy is not science. And if you come away from this talk with one thing in mind, it should be this understanding that policy is not science, but that the recommendations and the dietary guidance that we give in America is based on policy. The Dietary Guidelines for Americans in 2010 says in the policy guideline that the food patterns it recommends have not ever been specifically tested for health benefits. So to figure out what the dietary guidelines are and what they do, a little brief history of that. The dietary goals and guidelines are not my plate in the food pyramid and food label, but they are the things which direct what's going to be on the pyramid and what's going to be on the food label. What we focus on in terms of the label, you notice that protein, there's not a percent daily value of protein. We don't highlight that in the dietary guidelines. It's not a highlighted part of a food label. But the dietary guidelines are what go into the food label. They also directly influence how and what foods are processed, how they're manufactured, the reduced fat, whole grain, low sodium, that's the food manufacturer's way of responding to what the dietary guidelines are telling us as consumers that we should be choosing as foods. It also directs how over $1 billion in federal research money is spent. NIH essentially does not fund nutrition studies that aren't in compliance with the dietary guidelines. So this is sort of boiled down. Michael Pollan has been both a critic of the dietary guidelines and their focus on food components and little minute things like omega-3 fatty acids and that sort of thing. He's also been a big proponent of them in saying what they're telling us to do, which is eat food, not too much, mostly plants, is basically the right message. So he does contradict himself a little bit, and all of this is to say that we're doing this, eating food, not too much, mostly plants, so that we can prevent chronic disease. But this idea of eating food in order to prevent chronic disease is a fairly new concept in nutrition. And when he says we should all eat like our grandmothers or great-grandmothers, if you look back at how our grandmothers and great-grandmothers were eating back in 1955, it wasn't mostly plants. It was mostly animal products. And they weren't eating that way in order to prevent chronic disease, although they were pretty healthy back then. They were eating that way because that's where the nutrition was. So this part has sort of been left out as we changed our focus. So what I want to get to next is just a very brief, I'm not going to give you the complete history of nutrition guidance in the US, but I want to point out to you that nutrition has never, ever been just about nutrition. It's when we give out nutrition guidance to the public, there's always some aspect of acting like a responsible moral citizen. So back in the 1880s, we thought about the body as a machine. That's how we visualized it. The very first dietary surveys in America were given out by people concerned about how to feed workers. So we were interested in how much food, specifically protein, we had to feed a worker in order to pay him a living wage. So we were not interested in fruits and vegetables. Fruits and vegetables were considered luxuries. Workers should spend their money acquiring calories and adequate protein because that's what made them good machines. You had the fuel to feed the machines in terms of calories, and you had the material to rebuild the machine in terms of protein. And as a responsible good citizen, you purchased food based on calories and protein. And that made you a good worker. In World War II, our thinking about nutrition became a little more nuanced as we learned about vitamins and minerals. There was this notion that there are these things in the body and they contribute to good health. We can't really see them and we don't really know whether we're healthy or not, whether we have them or not. So there became the German of the idea that there could be something wrong with you even though you seem perfectly healthy. And so we focused on food groups, we focused on acquiring essential nutrition. The idea was that the body was this big complicated factory, we had to get all the right inputs in order to make it work right, and you needed to follow dietary guidance for national security purposes. You need to be strong in the face of these 2 world wars. You need to be strong to defeat the enemy. And as a good citizen, you are going to save your wheat, meat, and fats for the troops. Why? Not because we wanted the troops to get heart disease and die, but because we considered these foods to be the most nutritious ones. And back home, you folks were going to have to manage on fish and vegetables, which of course now we've decided is what everybody should be eating all the time. So once again, this was not as much about nutrition per se, but about responsible, moral, good citizenship, following what we tell you to do. In the 1960s, we came up with the war on poverty. We began to focus on populations that we determined were hungry. It was also conveniently a place to move commodity foods, but well-meaning. But again, there was a connection between improving a social issue through food. The idea was that if we fed poor children adequate food in school through the school breakfast and school lunch program, then their brains would be well fed, they would be able to succeed in school, they would be able to pull themselves out of poverty. And so once we put these programs in place, if these children then didn't follow along and manage to succeed, despite other institutional issues, that was sort of their fault and not ours. After all, we fed them. So nutrition guidance became a soldier in the war on poverty. Through the 1970s, we had a lot of social and economic instability. We had Ansel Keys there on the right telling us that saturated fat caused heart disease. We had Frances Moore LePay on the left, who was part of this beginning of concerns about animal welfare and animal rights movement that Peter Singer was starting. And she married those concerns about hunger across the globe that were occurring because of various weather patterns that caused droughts and famines, along with the health issues that Ansel Keys had raised. And then finally, this other middle one is that beef prices had gone up. And American housewives were boycotting meat, not for health reasons, not for sustainability reasons, but because it was expensive. And they were boycotting meat in order to try and drive the price back down. Frances Moore LePay sort of wrapped all of this up in a neat ideological, nutritional, economic package. And this sort of came to a head at the 1974 National Nutrition Policy Study Conference, where Ted Kennedy got up and said, the problem is, so this was brought about, the conference was brought about to address rising meat prices, but it began to deal with those other issues. The problem is Americans are obese, we're eating all this food, all of this meat that's going into our animals that should go to these hungry people that are starving in these other countries, and as a result of doing that, not only will we deal with health issues, but meatless meals are cheaper, and that will address those economic issues as well. So again, social issues all tied up with these idea of nutritional issues. So a couple of years later, Senator George McGovern introduced a report called the Dietary Goals for Americans, basically saying that too much fat, sugar, salt can be and are linked directly to heart disease, cancer, obesity, and stroke, among other killer diseases. So his venture into policy was to say that we're going to pass out a single dietary prescription, low in fat, low in saturated fat, low in cholesterol, low in animal products in general, that we're going to apply to the entire population, and it's going to address all of these major diseases. So our dietary guidance went from the federal government telling us what we should eat in order to acquire adequate nutrition, to what not to eat, and on that list of things not to eat were a lot of animal products. Butter, eggs, whole milk, whole cheeses, and, of course, meat, particularly red meat. The response, so predictably from the meat and the eggs folks, they were not happy with this. But there were a lot of nutrition scientists and folks in the medical profession who also thought that this was a debacle. They complained that the goals arose from incomplete and prejudiced information, that McGovern's committee had looked at simply one slice of the science that was available, which was true. They chose the people to come to the hearings based on whether or not they would testify about reducing the amount of meat and fat in the diet. The scientists also said that fat, saturated fat, and cholesterol aren't causally linked to disease, and that the dietary modifications that these folks are proposing are not harmless. We don't know what's going to happen when we give out this single dietary prescription to this incredibly diverse nation and put it into practice. So there were some intended and some unintended consequences associated with this policy. As I like to say, federal dietary guidance fixing America's health is what breaks since 1977. So yeah, we decreased our intake of red meat and we increased our intake of wheat flour, as we were told to do. We decreased our intake of eggs, butter, lard, and tallow, as we were told to do, and we increased our intake of vegetable oil. We decreased whole milk and increased low-fat milk, and even our intake of fruits and vegetables went up over the 30 years after the dietary guidelines were created. The changes in the food supply reflect this. So we had an increase from 1970 to 2008, an increase in about 400 calories from flour and cereal products and the fats and oils that are added to them. We had an increase of about 20 calories from meat and eggs. So if you hear the notion that the obesity in America can be blamed on our meat intake, this really is not demonstrated by these numbers. The impact of the dietary goals on heart disease, which was a major focus, is that heart disease, we don't measure incidence of heart disease in America for some reason. So the closest sort of approximation we have of that, these are hospital discharges. So people who come into the hospital with cardiovascular disease. People might be double counted, but again, it's the best numbers we've got. Heart disease didn't go down. In fact, seems to have gone up a little bit. Cancer definitely went up. These are incidence numbers. Overweight and obesity, again, these are rates of obesity across the population, as I showed you before. They went up. And probably most troubling is that after about a 10-year lag time, which is in keeping with the natural history of the disease, our rates of diabetes have skyrocketed. And as you can see in each chart, there has been a disproportional impact on minority populations. So blacks have been more adversely affected by these changes. I'm not going to go into that now, but there are probably some good biological reasons why that is. It's not that they're worse at following the guidelines. So as these adverse health changes were taking place across America, our dietary goals remained remarkably consistent. The 77 goals in the 2010 dietary guidelines pretty much say the same thing, focusing particularly on keeping saturated fat consumption low and keeping cholesterol consumption low as well. And as we know, this was to come from animal products. The effects of dietary guidance go beyond health, though. Another set of unintended consequences, foods that were not recommended were the less processed foods. Things that we talk about here as whole foods, whole milk, butter, beef. Foods that were recommended were the more processed foods. They were foods that the food industry could manipulate and remove the unwanted cholesterol, the unwanted saturated fat, replace it with vegetable oils, flour, fats and oils, cereals, and bakery baskets. But you notice that the whole foods bring a whole lot more money. That number is the amount of money that goes back to the farmer. And so what we saw is that the percentage of the food dollar that's returned to the farmer also dropped after the dietary guidelines. So I couldn't find the numbers before then, but my understanding is that farmers were getting about 30 cents on the food dollar for many, many decades before the dietary guidelines were created. And although this is not the only force at work, there was a precipitous drop in that food share dollar after the dietary guidelines were created. So, what's going on in the science? Christopher Gardner at Stanford says there's no gold standard for putting together inadequate evidence in the best possible way. And the phrase inadequate evidence is really what we have in nutrition. So starting with this came from the 77 Dietary Goals themselves. They were making the argument that the increase in saturated fat in our diet was the cause of heart disease in America. But if you look at this chart, it's clear that although there's been an increase in fat intake, it's come from vegetable sources, not animal sources, and in fact, the sources of animal fat have been decreasing for a considerable number of years. So this is from the first goals. They got the science wrong there. Ansel Keys himself said there's no connection between cholesterol in food and cholesterol in the blood. He said this way back when in the 50s. He said it again in 1997. That didn't stop us from making that connection in the dietary guidelines. This is a meta-analysis from 2010. There's no significant evidence for concluding that dietary saturated fat is associated with risk of coronary heart disease or cardiovascular disease. This is a broad meta-analysis of a lot of other studies. Cancer incidence in vegetarians, you always hear that vegetarians have less, especially colon cancer. This is the EPIC study, was done in, actually, I think the UK, but basically colorectal cancer in non-vegetarians is lower than colorectal cancer in vegetarians. So all of these connections just really don't pan out. And I'm just taking parts of the study. Are there studies on the other side that say the opposite? Absolutely. But these studies are here also. And these are from sources that are legitimate, that are authorized from universities. These are not fringe scientists, although when these kinds of studies come out, they do tend to get swept under the rug. So clinical trials, this is from a Cochrane review, again, prestigious group of scientists. There's no clear effect of any dietary fat intervention, whether you lower fat or whether you change it from saturated to polyunsaturated, that improves mortality, cardiovascular mortality, heart attack, stroke, cancer, diabetes. So that's a fairly recent, and again, a Cochrane review. So what is holding all of this in place? Well, my former field, nutrition epidemiology, which, when you look at it closely, is the softest of soft sciences. And it's run pretty much by this guy, Harvard School of Health, Dr. Walter Willett. I like to call him the godfather of nutrition epidemiology. He created this field. He has been at the head of it for about 40 years now. And he runs the largest studies and therefore the most publications that come out of nutrition epidemiology. My husband, who's a smarty pants, likes to say that nutrition epidemiology studies are strongly associated with the rise in obesity, because that's how we talk in nutrition epidemiology. Walter Willett helped run the Nurses' Health Study, which started in 1976. It was started to look at birth control. But when they saw the writing on the wall with the dietary guidelines, they started passing out dietary surveys too, because they understood that that's where the money was going to be. Then those were just nurses. They followed this up with a population of doctors, 97% white, well-educated, and you can see the number of studies that has come out of these two observational studies has almost kept up with the rise in obesity. In fact, it's begun to surpass that. So, what we have in nutrition epidemiology, besides a lot of other issues, this is sort of the big confounding issue, which is the healthy adherer or the placebo effect. And the way that I explain this is that if I told you to eat a low-fat diet and to avoid eggs and meat and to wear a pink bow tie, some of you would do what I asked you to. And you reduce your intake of fat, saturated fat, and meat, and you wear your pink bow tie even though you don't like pink and you don't like bow ties. Another group of people would say, I'm not wearing the pink bow tie, and the rest of that stuff I'm not listening to either. So the group of people who follow our health prescriptions are a different kind of people than the people who don't. And you can see this in something like this. red meat consumption and mortality. This is a Willett study. And basically the conclusion of the study was that eating red meat increases your chances of dying from heart disease and cancer, and increases your chances of dying in general, which is a little silly because all of our chances of dying are about the same. But if you look at the fine print, what it really says is that men and women with higher intake of red meat were less likely to be physically active and were more likely to be current smokers, to drink alcohol, and to have a higher body mass index. So what it's really saying is that eating red meat increases your chances of being an elderly health professional who smokes, drinks, and doesn't exercise. So the problem with this is that this gets put into policy. So this is Monachemi in 2013, overstatement of results in nutrition and obesity peer-reviewed literature. We generalize results to population, like the entire population, that aren't represented by the sample. We report them as causal, and then we make policy recommendations based on these associations, and this is a problem. Is it time for me to stop yet? Almost. So where are we now? The times they are changing, maybe, maybe not. How do we promote meat when the goalposts keep moving? If it's not cholesterol, it's saturated fat. If it's not saturated fat, it's TMAO. We've tried to address these things. The lean meat, we have omega-3, we have grass-fed, we have antibiotic-free, we have natural, we have organic, non-GMO, certified humane, everything that consumers ask for. Now we are going to have cows that have high school equivalency degree and are bilingual because if the consumer asks for it, we're going to figure out how to do it for them. But what's happening as a result of these guidelines is that we're really not eating enough protein. So 40% of the population does not get enough protein, and most females over the age of 8 don't get enough protein. This is from the 2015 guidelines report. And this is part of the problem. You don't need meat to get protein. You can get your protein from broccoli. Has anybody ever seen this meme? Yes. Kind of cute, huh? So let's see how you do that. 4 ounces of steak versus over 9 cups of broccoli. So these are compared on a caloric basis. You can see in red that none of the essential amino acid requirements are met from the broccoli, 9 cups of it. You meet most of them with the same, with this 4 ounces of steak. If you took a couple more bites of steak, you could probably meet them all, but you'd need 18 cups of broccoli, twice the calories, to get all of the essential amino acids. That's a lot of broccoli, a lot of chew in there. And you might hear, well, what about giraffes, hippos, and gorillas? How do they get so big and so strong and so smart without meat? Well, giraffes have a rumen, and I'm not going to talk about rumen because that's Peter's area of expertise. But they have a way of turning food into other things, called a rumen. Hippos eat for high volume, so it's the amount of food going through, and do you really want to look like a hippo anyway? Well, you know, up to you, but it's high volume eating. So they eat a lot of food, and they poop a lot of food. And then gorillas, would you like to discuss with me where you get your protein? I'd love to. First of all, they do eat protein. They eat insect protein, unless you have an extremely fastidious gorilla. They also have an increased area in their gut for fermentation. It's not a rumen, but it acts in similar ways. They are also high-volume eaters. They're not particularly good at jeopardy, but they also do this. They're coprophagic, so if you want to eat like a gorilla and not waste all that food coming out the other end, then you just eat it again. So, next time somebody says gorillas are big and strong and they're vegans, you can say, yeah, but I don't really want to eat that way. So, red meat does provide a lot of nutrients that are shortfall nutrients, especially for young women and for older people, and in women across the board. So, how do we change the perception of consumers that think that they can get their nutrition from broccoli? Educate them. Essential nutrition from meat, it gives you more protein with fewer calories. It gives you some of the nutrients that are missing in the diet, specifically zinc and iron. These are important for growth, for healing, and for mothers. Vitamins A and D, which again tend to be short for fall nutrients. There is no additives, enrichments, or fortification necessary. This is nature's packaging, and you get it all. And tip-to-tail eating captures nutrition in a remarkably efficient way. Beef liver is one of the best sources of choline, which is, again, a shortfall nutrient. Saturated fat is, but should not be, a nutrient of concern. It is not linked to chronic disease. We also need to educate the consumer about the environment. As we heard last night, sustainability involves lifestyle. So it's not just good for you, it's good for the planet.
I have to think they deliver stores in meters.
They don't know. So I'm going to pass this off to Peter.